Good afternoon. We are continuing our series on the anti-patterns that are opposed to the 8 principles in Celebrate Recovery. Today we're going to be talking about Principle 2 and the anti-pattern that goes along with it. For those of you that are just joining us in this series, I encourage you to go and look at the first episode. But for a quick recap, an anti-pattern is something that is aligned against a given norm or a given principle. So in this case, we're going to be looking at the anti-pattern for Principle 2, earnestly believe that God exists. So in order to get to that anti-pattern, let's break down what Principle 2 means. Earnestly believe that God exists. Well, in order to do that, right? I mean, I have to believe that God is who He says He is, that the God of the Old Testament is the same as the God in the New Testament, and that He wants a personal relationship with me, that I matter to Him, right? He is omniscient, He is omnipotent, He knows everything, He can be in all places at once, and He personally cares for me, and that He has the power, right? Because through Him all things were created and all things can be changed, right? He can bend the laws of space and time to accomplish His purposes. So He has the power where I don't. As we saw in Principle 1, I don't have the power to recover, but He has the power to help me recover from my hurts, habits, and hangups. And so when we look at the anti-pattern against Principle 2, it really is, no, I don't believe in God. There isn't such a being because of the things that I've experienced, right? If God was real, He wouldn't have placed me in this horrible situation or had me go through this experience that dramatically changed my life for the worst. And even though those things have happened, right, we definitely aren't trying to sweep under the rug anybody's hurts, habits, or hangups, right? What you've experienced, what you've gone through, those hurts, those are powerful hurts, and we totally get it. Maybe you've said, I've had to survive based upon my own abilities. God abandoned me. Because if God was real, He would have picked me up and placed me on the rock, and I would have been safe, right? I can think of any sort of tragedies that people have experienced, and it's not to say that those didn't happen, that those aren't real. No, 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 no. We are recognizing that when we experience this emotion, we are we're suffering. We are in the anti-pattern that places us against Principle 2. Sometimes people will say, you don't understand, when other people try to counsel or coach or come alongside them, right? You don't understand what I've been through. I've always been this way. It's how I was born. I was meant to be this way. I was meant to suffer. I was meant to go through that abuse. I was meant all of those things. And so what's the anti-pattern? What's actually happening whenever we feel this way or we're talking with somebody who is saying these things? Well, that person is dealing with trauma, and that trauma can be significant. We're not saying that the trauma was expected. We're not saying that the trauma was punishment. We're not saying that the trauma was anything prescribed for that person. What's happened is that we have forgotten, or because it was so bad, we have just it's been put out of our mind, that God's will for us is not to experience the trauma. God's will for us is never to have that abuse happen. God's will for us was never to have that tragedy that made us homeless. God's will for us is to be in relationship with Him, to be made whole again. And so it's important that we recognize when we're suffering trauma or when we're speaking with somebody who has suffered trauma. We have to remember that there's God's will, there's the enemy's will, and then there's people's free will. You may have suffered trauma for the decisions that you made. Maybe you made some bad decisions in your past. Or you're suffering trauma because of somebody else's bad decisions. or you're suffering trauma because the world is fallen. There will be tragedies. There will be bad things that occur because the world is not meant to last forever. It was originally until sin entered the world through the enemy, through Satan. So how do we help recover from trauma or PTSD or things like that, or that feeling where it's like, man, I wish I was never born in the first place? Well, to get out of trauma, we have to be born again. You're like, probably like Nicodemus when he heard this the first time, right? How can I be born again, right? I'm the way I am. But here it is, right? To be born again is to follow Jesus, is to realize that Jesus experienced the same betrayals. Jesus experienced the same hurts. The same blood was shed. The barbs that tore at his flesh when he was whipped by the Roman centurions, the nails through his wrists and hands and feet, right? When he was nailed to the cross, all of those things he took on because he knows that level of trauma. He knows the trauma that you've been experiencing or that I've been experiencing. And he wants us to heal. And he wants us to be born again, to be made new, to throw off our grave clothes like Lazarus, right? To be born again through the resurrection of Jesus. Because you got to remember, we shouldn't be afraid because God, through Jesus overcame the world. So whatever the world has thrown at you, Jesus has already overcome it. And so let's be born again through him. I hope this brings you some blessings today, and have a great day in Jesus' name.